Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. She is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies, blogger and commentator Phoebe Fletcher, and he is a former Green Party MP, well-known social justice activist and high-ranking Jedi Knight, Keith Locke. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, welfare and state house reforms were launched this week. Is Paula Bennett a hypocrite? Where are the jobs? And how do state tenants use 0800 numbers when they don't have phones? Issue 2, should Mike Moore be forced to resign as our US ambassador after he hosted a free trade deal party paid for by the tobacco and pharmaceutical industries who are hell-bent on using the free trade deal to erode New Zealand public health policy? Issue 3, Lucy Lawless and Shell Oil. Who was the real criminal? And we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with Issue 1. The welfare reforms originating from a hard right think tank are being implemented alongside state house reforms this week. The government says this is about breaking a cycle of dependency. Critics call it Benny bashing. Phoebe, Air New Zealand, Yellow Pages, TPK, MFAT, all announced hundreds of job losses this week alone, with thousands more expected to be cut in the public sector. Beneficiaries will be expected back to work, but where is the work going to be?
Well, this is a very good question, isn't it? I mean, the December 2011 Household Labour Force survey, which was put together by Statistics New Zealand, found that there were currently 150,000 people unemployed. And, you know, this is the problem, that the sort of jobs that the National Party are talking about are things like fruit picking and things that don't really suit solo mothers or beneficiaries, or require them to travel quite far. So there is a complete disjoint, I think, that is going on at the moment between the number of jobs that are actually available and the rhetoric in terms of, you know, these beneficiary reforms, which I think, you know, in some ways, we did talk about this before the election, that what is going on here is a lot of relabeling of different beneficiary categories, and that is going to affect some people in terms of, you know, their benefits getting cut in terms of the amount, but it is not as significant as the rhetoric that National was saying, but still it is in a very, very difficult climate, and it does affect, you know, some people that are quite vulnerable.
There have been many critics who have come out against the government's position on this. Many academics, many have sort of said, look, this just isn't going to work. But the populace still have an appetite for bashing beneficiaries. Have we gotten to that point with social policy where people really don't care about the results as long as they know that somehow solo mothers and beneficiaries aren't having a good time of it? Have we got to that point?
I don't think that we have. I think what is missing from the mainstream media is a level of analysis that is needed to fairly present ideas. And, you know, what we have in terms of, you know, the lobby groups that are working on behalf of beneficiaries and so on, you know, really up against, you know, massive kind of budgets in terms of public relations and so on, that makes it quite hard for them to pitch their case. So no, I don't think, you know, I think that once people do know the issues and they are presented them fairly, that, you know, there is New Zealand, you know, most New Zealanders like to think that our country is fair and have an idea of fairness.
Right. Keith, Paula Bennett received help owning her state home and training allowances, and admitted that she was so exhausted with part-time work that she needed to go back onto the DPB. Is she a hypocrite for forcing solo parents back to work with less help than she actually received?
I would say she is a hypocrite, and I think that training incentive allowance, and you know, it could be added to, actually. It could come back and it could be added to, because really, to get people into work, there are jobs around for certain skills, but you've got to train people for those skills. So, you know, perhaps even giving DPP mothers a computer and pay their broadband and get some courses going and all that sort of thing would help them
certainly do those things.
Prepare them. But they should have a choice. Like at the moment, we're implementing China's one-child policy, where except applied to beneficiaries. That is that if you have more than one child, you're going to be heavily penalised financially. It's just like in China, except in China they applied it to virtually the whole population.
Explain to me Paula's popularity with the National. Is it, do they see, I get the sense, and maybe this is being unfair or disingenuous, but I get the sense that they view her as a poacher turned gamekeeper, with her passive a solo parent, that she's an appropriate face to go through with these very, very far-ranging cutbacks for beneficiaries, but it's kind of okay because she's been there. Would that be
Yeah,
fair?
it is a bit of a PR spin that, you know, I'm the working class battler who's made it to be a minister, and I could do no wrong. Anything else is a misinterpretation. And it's interesting how all of these ministers and heads of department put a spin when they're doing something bad. You talked about the layoffs before. It's interesting when John Allen of MFAT talks about the layoffs, it's going to make the ministry more responsive and flexible, getting rid of 20% of the workforce.
Remarkable, isn't it?
The head of the housing in New Zealand said it's going to, you know, cutting off offices for people to go into to look for a state house and saying you've got to go on the phone instead. That's going to lead to a more consistent service. It's all spin, and I think Paula Bennett's part of that spin.
Phoebe, is there a disconnect between the academic research that drives poverty and right-wing rhetoric dressed up as welfare policy? How far are those 2 points now?
You mean the academic research around poverty?
Around poverty, to where national solutions are going.
I think there is a disconnect, and you know the problem is with academic research is that, as you will know, well I know being an academic, is that there are lots of people with lots of different opinions in an institution, and that you can have one person that thinks a particular way and publishes that way. All of our work is peer reviewed, but what happens is that there's a selection, you know, with the welfare working group and so on, of particular academics that are supporting that National Party line of rhetoric, and then there's another sort of problem that comes in terms of the media as well, that we have had a lot of cutbacks in terms of the number of journalists and so on in New Zealand, and that these journalists are under a lot of time pressure. These are, you know, big social issues that quite often aren't allocated enough time to, you know, perhaps go out and do the research, so they're leaning too heavily on the kind of PR line. So yes, I think there is a disconnect between proper discussions around, you know, who this actually affects. I mean, I note that, you know, Paula Bennett, if we talk about the example of solo mothers that, you know, had one child aged 14 and then had another baby, you know, she actually said this on television last year, that there were only 70 mothers in 2010 that fell into that category. So what you're seeing is, you know, a massive kind of a groundswell of attack, and it's done, you know, to, I guess, deflect attention from other policies that they're putting through as well, I think, and rally up the public support for further cutbacks.
Keith, the left have been outplayed on welfare, haven't they? Instead of blaming National for their union-busting policies in the 90s that led to our low-wage economy, the working poor resent beneficiaries for the money beneficiaries receive when compared to the minimum wage pittance they earn each week. How did the left win back the argument of a compassionate welfare state?
Well, I think just solidarity is the key concept here, and there is a lot of solidarity going on at the moment around some of the union struggles, the rest home workers, the port workers in particular. There have been pickets, I've been on the picket line myself, and I think that tradition of solidarity has to be built on. It's interesting with the port struggle, that the head of the port company is saying it's sort of treachery for the workers here to call for international support.
That's right, yeah.
And then I was looking back into history today, and the big 1890 waterfront strike was based on New Zealand workers giving solidarity to Australian workers by not unloading ships from a strike in Australia, you know, a port strike in Australia. So there's a long tradition of workers hanging together nationally, internationally, and I think it's got to go between those in work and those out of work as well. I'm not sure in unions in particular there's a great hostility to beneficiaries, but through the media, etc., there is built up a certain bludgers sort of
National
propaganda.
have done a very good job of this wedge politics, though, haven't they? Because they're playing off the working poor against beneficiary poor in a way that is very difficult to get in between.
I think so, but this is something that tends to happen in economic hard times too. There's certain things that occur, like you tend to get a rise in nationalism, and I suppose when people are feeling hard done by, it's easy to turn around and look at, you know, another group as potentially being the cause of that.
Right, right.
So no, I think they have done a good job of what I would call dog whistle politics.
yep.
But, you know, if you look at, for example, the state housing situation as well, I mean, you have had plans that have gone through in places like Glen Innes to refurbish those state houses. And so, you know, you're getting a drop in the state houses that are actually going to be owned by the state and where people are actually going to be able to be looked after. So while on the one hand I think that they're raking certain aspects of it, like the solo mothers, which, you know, we keep hearing from 1973 there's been a massive boom in those.
That's
well,
right, yeah,
we got the contraceptive pill in the 1960s. You know, the woman's position has changed. On the other hand, there are, you know, aspects of their policy that are going through that are really going to hurt people.
Right. Question to both of you. As Brian Rudman pointed out in his New Zealand column this week, State House tenants are the most likely not to have phones. How does setting up an 0800 number for those most likely not to have a phone equate to anything vaguely resembling a public service?
Yeah, that's true. If you haven't got a phone, you can't phone up. So how can you get a state house?
Yep.
But even worse than that, people looking for state houses, they're often new migrants, refugees, they're people without necessarily full command of the language.
Sure, sure.
And you can imagine the terror, even if they do get to a phone, phoning up. If I make a mistake here,
Yes.
and I've only got this phone call's my only chance,
Yep.
I'm done for,
Yep.
and I won't have any place to live. And they've also cancelled the service, which was a good service they set up. See, only about a quarter of the people who apply for state houses get them, and the other 3/4 they were going to help them
That's
into
right, that's right.
private rentals, and
And
now
they
they
shut
said,
that
oh,
down.
well, we won't bother with that
Yeah,
anymore,
yeah.
so they've closed that down.
All government departments don't allow 0800 number use from cell phones, so those who do have mobile phones still won't be able to call this 0800 number.
To me, it seems crazy. I mean, I agree with Keith. There are too many people that are, you know, not fluent English speakers. This creates massive problems. Also, quite often in the areas where there are the most state houses, there also is the highest concentration of people without landlines. So I do think that this is very problematic.
Thank you, panel. Moving on to issue 2. News over the weekend that our US Ambassador Mike Moore hosted a free trade deal corporate function paid for by 2 industries hell-bent on using this free trade deal to erode New Zealand public health policy has led to calls for Moore to be sacked. Phoebe, we know from WikiLeaks that the US Embassy has been active in trying to promote propaganda that Pharmac should be done away with so that American pharmaceutical interests can be advanced through this free trade deal. Why would our ambassador host a party they funded when they want to actually harm Pharmac?
It's a very good question, isn't it? And I think it's something that needs to be dragged out into the open. There are massive issues around the TPPA in terms of all of the negotiations actually being kept secret for 4 years afterwards. So, you know, for those of you that don't know, this is a massive agreement that affects so many different areas of our economy. It's not only Pharmac and medicine and so on, but it's also the internet. And, you know, there is also the potential as well for corporations to be able to sue the government that comes in under this agreement. So it's something that needs to be debated publicly. And, you know, I would say that, you know, perhaps it's a lure of American politics that is going on in Mike Moore's decision to do that, because tobacco lobbyists have always had, you know, quite a strong role within American politics. But I think, you know, the Australian ambassador declined to go, and this is something that needs to be discussed.
Keith, we only found out about this, exactly as Phoebe points out, because Australia pulled out of the function, because the very same tobacco company currently using the Australian free trade deal to sue the Australian government for plain packaging on tobacco was a sponsor. Shouldn't New Zealanders be deeply concerned about allowing big tobacco any influence in a free trade deal?
Yeah, I think that's so right. I think they're actually using the Australia-Hong Kong free trade agreement.
Right, yes,
The Australian one, but that just shows the danger of these free trade investment agreements.
Yeah.
And it's wrong. How dangerous it is really to appoint someone like Mike Moore, who's a zealot, an absolute free trade and investment zealot, and thinks ideologically they're all good, when clearly, in the case of Phil and Morris in Australia and potentially New Zealand, they're not so good. And even today it's announced that the American dairy industry has said, oh, perhaps we could come into the TPP as well, as long as you break up Fonterra. So
why
it goes on and on to undermine the New Zealand economy.
Phoebe, Paul Buchanan in his Scoop column last week suggests that America is forcing us into this free trade deal as a strategic containment move to counter Chinese influence in the South Pacific. If this is the case, should we be signing a deal that seems to have more to do with American hegemonic structure and propping that up than any actual economic benefit for us?
Well, I think this is always the problematic thing about free trade deals. And I mean, what Paul Buchanan's comments do line up with is what the Russian hackers were saying when they got into Murray McCully's emails,
Right.
of course.
The Russian hackers.
That it
Russian
was
hackers,
about
yeah.
kind of fear of, Chinese economic development across the region.
Yeah.
I think that, to me this is particularly problematic when we look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade losing so many staff, is that I worry that we're going to end up leaning on the interpretation of larger countries a lot more than we have been already. And I don't personally, and, perhaps this is me being quite harsh, but I see New Zealand as it's very naive in terms of its foreign affairs relations, particularly when it comes to particular regions of the world like Middle East, North Africa, and so on. That I think that we do need to have the staff that are actually thinking independently, and part of being an independent nation is making sure that we preserve that autonomy. And much of the discussions that they are having at the moment are things that should be open to wider public debate, because they are things that many members of the New Zealand public would surely want to have a say in.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Keith, how do you say no to America? How do you say no?
Well, you just have to pursue your own independent course and your own independent national interests. And I think Phoebe's right that if you have one or two isolated New Zealanders and embassies around the world and the big issue comes, how do I respond to this? I'll trot down to the Australian embassy or the American
See
embassy.
what they want us to say. Yeah.
And so much of the New Zealand state, the sort of administration and the police and the SIS and Foreign Affairs is sort of captured by America. You see that in the .com thing, where the police acted as a branch of the FBI. 76 agents, 2 helicopters, for what? Was total rubbish. And now the prosecutors, the New Zealand prosecutors, acting on behalf of the American government, twice are trying to keep him in jail.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Just we have to follow America, even though it's against our national interests.
Question to both of you: will New Zealand sign the free trade deal within the life of this government? Do you think we had Tim Grosser on here on the show, probably in the longest TV interview he's ever done on the free trade deal, I predict pretty strongly saying that he didn't think it would get signed, and he didn't think it would get signed because there were just too many conflicting interests. Do you think it's going to get signed?
I do think it will be signed. Isn't it due to be signed halfway through this year, Keith?
Well, I'm not sure it will be, because particularly if there's a big outcry in New Zealand over some of the provisions into it, if they really try and knock out.
But I thought the thing was that it was only announced once it is signed. So, the kind of issues that are occurring at the moment are at the negotiating table.
Well, Japan and Canada are still throwing problems, aren't they?
They're just coming into it.
And
then there's all the stuff about is TPP changing into an attack on China, the American allies against China. And Grosser says, no, it isn't. We'll walk out of it is. But there's voices in America saying just that. And I think what's happening means that it's going to be a bit complicated.
I thought Japan and Canada had less influence as latecomers. I think it will be interesting to see, but I don't think that the New Zealand public are going to have much say in what occurs at any rate. And, we can see that by the fact that all the negotiations around it are going to be kept secret for 4 years afterwards.
That's right. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. So, Lucy Lawless versus Shell Oil. Phoebe, you wrote a great blog asking why the New Zealand police are doing Shell Oil's dirty work by charging Lucy Lawless with burglary. Does this have echoes with the way the New Zealand police went to work for Hollywood over the Mega Upload case? Who do the New Zealand police work for? Us or American corporates?
I think this is a very good question, and I wrote that blog because I was quite concerned by the media that was occurring around it. First of all, I couldn't think of any other instances where protesters doing a similar kind of action had actually been charged with burglary. And Greenpeace have made a statement saying that they didn't actually steal anything. And secondly, the actual media around it. I was quite disturbed by one article that James Ware wrote for the Dominion Post, where he cited some professor at an Ohio university talking about how climate change was not occurring in that region. Well, you know, he might look at the Daron survey that was done in 2009 that found that 97% of publishing scientists on climate change believe that it is, you know, human-made and occurring. So, you know, I think that there are big issues around the sort of media here, and I think this has been kind of trumped up charges that are really allowing Shell to get away with quite a lot.
That's right, that's right. Keith, Shell is using the melting Arctic to drill for oil with a 40% chance of an oil spill, while they also face charges that they're killing Nigerians who oppose Shell's oil exploitation. Who's the real criminal, Shell or Lucy Lawless?
Well, I think if you look at it in terms of the future of the world, that Shell's the criminal. Just look at it in common sense basis. Drilling in Antarctic in the Arctic is much more complicated than drilling know, off the coast of New Zealand. If there is a spill, the logistics of cleaning up, you haven't got many other ships around, the oil doesn't disperse in the same way. You know, just huge problems. So
massive risks.
And plus, why should we be drilling for oil in these very difficult places instead of getting the energy efficiency to reduce the oil use in the world and of course help stop climate change at the same time. So on all of those bases, Shell isn't the one to be trusted. They've done some pretty bad things in the past, and one thing we can use against Shell has been used in the past. I think when there was some problem in the North Sea with a Shell oil rig, I think they had an international boycott on Shell products.
That's right.
And it changed Shell's policy sort of overnight on that particular issue. So, you know, the consumers, because it is a competitive industry, the oil industry, we do have a certain amount of power which we can use, I think. And of course,
the only thing I worry about with boycotts is that I think is it about 95% of Nigeria's economy is dependent on oil. So I think that, you know, that ends up, because of the way that things are stacked up, ends up hurting the people that are poorest. Like if you look at Nigeria, isn't it 75 or 80% earn less than $1 a day? You know, and I think Shell have done terrible things there that they have attempted to blame on the locals. Like, you know, if we look at Ogoniland in the Niger Delta, there's more oil spilt there than there was actually off the coast of Florida. And this is something that they keep trying to blame on the locals, although there's been independent reports that have said that they have. I think the best thing that you can do, and this is if you shop at Z Oil as well, because they own all the downstream components.
That's right,
they look like they're New Zealand, but they're actually buying Shell oil. As contact them and tell them your opinions about, you know, about the way that they actually carry out their work environmentally and humanitarian-wise. I mean, that 40% figure that you were stating in terms of the probability of a spill in the Chukchi Sea, that figure was actually from the US Federal Department of Mineral Exploration.
Hardly a woolly socialist organisation, is it?
I think we've got to put a bit of pressure on the distributors too. Like Z Oil, one thing that disturbed me, the head of that was quoted as saying they're going to boycott Iranian oil. Following American foreign policy, this is Z in New Zealand saying they're going to boycott Iranian oil, following the American foreign policy, because he said, "Oh, I think people would like that." You know, New Zealanders who export meat to Iran want to undermine their own national interests by following this airy-fairy line of the United States, and somehow there's a nuclear weapon coming out of Iran.
Question to both of you. How much pressure will be on to send a message to other protesters by making an example of Lucy Lawless? I mean, this burglary charge is ridiculous.
Well, I think Lucy Lawless would become even more of a hero if they proceed in a heavy-handed way, just in a way Doc Commons in some ways become a bit of a hero the way they've moved against him. But, so, you know, I don't think there's any...
Are they going to come down on harder on it?
I don't think they are. In terms of the legal case, I would say it's pretty weak. I think that we have this thing in New Zealand like they have in the United States, which is a difficulty with actresses and actors expressing opinions. Actresses and actors are people too, with brains and minds, you know, and they should be allowed to do so, I think. But I think this is just, you know, trumped up charges that it really is a public relations line, and it's because they know that the story is going to be reported around the world.
Yeah, yeah. Let's wrap the show with last word. Phoebe, your last word this week is?
Well, I was going to talk about MFAT, but we've already discussed that. So what I would like to say is that I've got my close eye on what's going on with Māori television at the moment, because I've noticed that David Farrar has started blogging about how low he perceives their ratings to be. Anyone who's in television will tell you the problems around the way that we construct ratings in New Zealand. But with the job losses that are going on at Te Puni Kaukari and them losing control over broadcasting, I would say that Māori television is a space where you should be watching closely.
Really? You think there are going to be more cutbacks?
I think so, yes.
Well, that's juicy. Keith, your final word this week is?
I'm disturbed the way the media seems to be buying into this sort of right-wing campaign to reduce access to bail, reduce access to parole. Of course, bail is for people who haven't been convicted in the court. They're innocent until proven guilty, and you know, the media's played up that a bit. But I was quite disturbed. National Radio a couple of days ago was interviewing the father of Nikki Goodwin, who was murdered in 1995, and they do this sort of tear-jerking thing about interviewing the father and what's the father think about what's his name, Mark Goodwin, being released on parole. Well, parole is so important for people's rehabilitation. They have a period where they're released under conditions, and I wish they'd run more stories the opposite, saying, isn't it good as a parent that he's been largely rehabilitated, he's in a job, he's, why not glorify the fact that people can be rehabilitated, and rather than all the sob story about how someone's evil and will be evil for the rest of their days and never be let out of jail. And the media, particularly Radio New Zealand, should not buy into that right-wing psyche.
Amen. Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Keith. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word, on the tail end of Keith's position there. The Sensible Sentencing Trust has predictably jumped into the terrible Turangi rape case and has claimed the 10-year sentence handed out to Rarangi Mark Marino wasn't long enough. You wouldn't be human if you didn't feel anger and disgust at what this teenager has done, but allowing the Sensible Sentencing Trust to whip up that anger into a lynch mob froth of harder and longer sentences is not a solution. Part of the problem here is, as Keith pointed out, the media and its if it bleeds it leads style of coverage, because shock stories about crime gain ratings. In March 2010, crime made up only 14% of all the stories on TVNZ's 6 PM One Network News, yet was represented a staggering 35% of the time in the headlines. The impact is that the shock value of crime is vastly overrepresented in news headlines, so that the impression left with viewers is one of a Mad Max post-apocalyptic nightmare requiring Dirty Harry to sort out. We can't let our justifiable anger warp social policy into vengeance. The reality is our murder rate has halved in the last 20 years and crime is coming down. Using the exception to introduce legislation that will decide the rule for everyone, which is what the Sensible Sentencing Trust wants, isn't sensible or trustworthy. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with the other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.